What if the excuses you repeat most often are protecting you from something you do not want to face? You may know exactly what needs to be done, yet still postpone the difficult conversation, delay the important task, abandon a promising habit, or wait for motivation that rarely arrives on schedule. This is not simply a problem of laziness. Your behavior is influenced by discomfort, emotion, uncertainty, habits, attention, and the decisions you make when no one is watching. When you understand those patterns, self-discipline becomes less about forcing yourself and more about becoming deliberate with your choices. In this audiobook, you will examine the psychological reasons behind avoidance, learn how responsibility changes decision-making, understand how habits and focused attention support consistency, and discover how setbacks can become useful information rather than reasons to quit. You will also confront a more personal question. Can you learn to trust yourself through what you repeatedly do? If you value thoughtful personal growth, subscribe to Audiobook Legacy and continue with us. Now, begin by examining the excuses you normally accept without question. Chapter 1. Identify excuses as avoidance and confront their real psychological causes. Most excuses do not begin with laziness. They usually begin with discomfort. A difficult task appears, an uncertain decision needs to be made, or a responsibility becomes harder than expected, and the mind quickly searches for an explanation that makes avoidance feel reasonable. You tell yourself you are too tired, too busy, not ready, or waiting for the right circumstances. Sometimes those explanations are completely legitimate. People genuinely become exhausted. Schedules become crowded. Circumstances can create real limitations. The important distinction is not whether every excuse is false. It is whether the explanation is being used to understand a limitation or to avoid confronting one. That distinction changes the way you understand self-discipline. If you treat every excuse as evidence of bad character, you may create unnecessary guilt without changing your behavior. But if you examine excuses as signals of avoidance, you can begin asking a more useful question. What am I trying not to experience right now? The answer might be failure. It might be embarrassment, boredom, uncertainty, rejection, criticism, effort, or the possibility of discovering that your current abilities are not yet strong enough. Sometimes the uncomfortable feeling is not connected to the task itself. It comes from what completing the task might require from you afterward. Understanding that hidden discomfort is the first serious step toward changing your behavior. Consider someone who repeatedly says they want to exercise but never follows through. They might say their schedule is unpredictable, the gym is too far away, or they need better equipment. Any one of those statements could be true. But suppose they continue finding new obstacles even after those problems are solved. The issue may no longer be logistics. The real difficulty may be tolerating the discomfort of beginning. Exercise requires effort before there is any immediate reward, and the person may have developed a habit of protecting themselves from that discomfort by producing explanations. The excuse becomes useful because it allows them to preserve their self-image. They can continue believing, "I would do it if circumstances were different," instead of facing the more uncomfortable possibility that their behavior has become inconsistent. This is why excuses can be psychologically attractive. They reduce immediate tension. If you decide that your unfinished work happened because you were too busy, you do not have to examine how much time you spent scrolling through your phone. If you blame a difficult colleague for every conflict, you do not have to consider whether your own communication became defensive. If you say you are waiting until you feel confident enough to apply for a better position, you do not have to face the possibility of rejection. The explanation protects you from an uncomfortable evaluation of your choices. For a short period, that protection can feel relieving, but repeated relief can gradually become repeated avoidance. There is another reason excuses become difficult to recognize. Most people do not consciously construct them as lies. They often experience the explanation as completely reasonable in the moment. Your mind notices the obstacle that supports avoidance while giving less attention to the alternatives that would require effort. You may genuinely feel tired after work, for example, but that does not automatically mean you cannot spend 20 minutes on something important. You may genuinely lack confidence, but that does not prove you need to wait until confidence appears. You may genuinely have a busy week, but that does not mean every available hour is already committed. The problem is not recognizing constraints. The problem is allowing a constraint to become a permanent explanation without examining what remains within your control. This is where self-awareness becomes practical rather than abstract. Self-awareness is not simply knowing your personality or understanding your emotions. In everyday life, it means noticing the moment when your explanation begins influencing your behavior. Pay attention to the sequence. Something becomes difficult. You experience an uncomfortable emotion. A thought appears that explains why action should be postponed. You accept the explanation. You experience temporary relief. Then the task remains unfinished. Over time, that sequence becomes familiar. The more familiar it becomes, the less conscious it feels. You can begin interrupting that sequence by becoming curious about the first uncomfortable moment. Imagine opening your laptop to complete an important report. You immediately notice that the document feels difficult to organize. Instead of starting, you check email. Then you answer a few messages. Then you decide that you should first clean your workspace. None of these actions seems outrageous. In fact, each one can appear productive. But if the same pattern occurs whenever meaningful work becomes mentally demanding, the issue deserves closer attention. Ask yourself what happened immediately before you started looking for something else to do. Was the task unclear? Were you afraid the result would not meet your own standards? Were you mentally tired? Did you expect the work to take longer than you wanted? The answer tells you more than the excuse does. Perfectionism can make this pattern especially difficult to recognize. A person may not say, "I am avoiding this because I am afraid of doing it badly." Instead, they may say, "I need more time to prepare before I begin." Preparation can be useful, but preparation without a defined stopping point can become avoidance. The person keeps collecting information, organizing materials, revising plans, or waiting for a better moment. Their behavior looks responsible from the outside. Internally, however, they may be protecting themselves from evaluation. If the work never reaches completion, it can never be judged. This does not mean every delay comes from fear. It means that when preparation repeatedly replaces action, the underlying reason deserves examination. The same pattern can appear in relationships. Someone knows they need to have a difficult conversation with a partner, family member, or co-worker. They tell themselves that the timing is not right. They wait for the other person to be in a better mood. They wait until they have found exactly the right words. They wait until they feel completely calm. Sometimes waiting is wise, but if the conversation remains postponed for weeks or months, the explanation may be functioning as emotional avoidance. The person is not necessarily avoiding the relationship. They may be avoiding the discomfort of expressing a boundary, admitting a mistake, asking for something, or hearing an answer they cannot control. This matters because self-discipline is not simply the ability to force yourself to work harder. Before disciplined behavior can become consistent, you need to understand what repeatedly pulls you away from it. Otherwise, you may keep creating increasingly complicated systems to solve a problem you have not correctly identified. You might download another productivity app, create another schedule, buy another notebook, or design another routine. Those tools can help, but they cannot resolve an avoidance pattern that remains psychologically attractive. If the real issue is discomfort, better organization alone may not be enough. There is a useful test you can apply to your own explanations. When you notice yourself postponing something important, separate the circumstance from the conclusion. I worked late tonight is a circumstance. Therefore, I cannot do anything important tonight is a conclusion. I have limited experience with this task is a circumstance. Therefore, I should not attempt it is a conclusion. This conversation may become uncomfortable is a circumstance. Therefore, I should avoid it is a conclusion. The first statements describe reality. The second statements interpret reality and determine behavior. That distinction gives you room to make a different decision. You can also examine whether the same explanation appears repeatedly. One difficult morning does not establish a pattern. One missed workout does not reveal your character. One delayed project does not prove that you lack discipline. But repeated behavior under similar conditions provides useful information. If you consistently become too tired when a task is boring, too busy when something is unfamiliar, or not ready when rejection is possible, the repetition deserves investigation. Your recurring excuses may be describing the exact situations in which your current emotional tolerance is weakest. That realization can feel uncomfortable because it removes some convenient explanations, yet it also restores something important: choice. If your behavior is entirely explained by external circumstances, there is little you can change. If you recognize that discomfort, fear, uncertainty, or boredom influences your decisions, you can begin working with those experiences instead of automatically obeying them. You do not need to deny the emotion. You need to stop treating the emotion as an instruction. This is especially important for confidence. Many people believe confidence must come before disciplined action. They wait until they feel capable, prepared, motivated, or certain. But confidence often depends on how you interpret your own behavior. When you repeatedly make commitments and abandon them, your internal assessment of yourself can become less reliable. You begin noticing the gap between what you intend to do and what you actually do. That gap affects how seriously you take your own decisions. Recognizing excuses allows you to address the behavior at its source, rather than trying to manufacture confidence through positive thinking. The goal, then, is not to eliminate every explanation for why something is difficult. That would be unrealistic. The goal is to become honest about the difference between a genuine limitation and a reason you are using to avoid discomfort. You can be tired and still choose a smaller version of the task. You can be uncertain and still gather the information necessary for a decision. You can lack confidence and still take a reasonable first step. You can have legitimate responsibilities and still examine whether your priorities reflect what you claim matters to you. The next time you hear yourself saying, "I can't do this right now," pause before accepting the statement. Ask what can't actually means. Does it mean physically impossible? Does it mean financially impossible? Does it mean genuinely incompatible with your responsibilities? Or does it mean uncomfortable, inconvenient, uncertain, boring, or emotionally difficult? Those categories are not interchangeable. When you separate them, you begin seeing your behavior with greater accuracy. And perhaps the most revealing question is even simpler. If the excuse disappeared, what would I have to face? You might discover a task you have been avoiding because it challenges your competence. You might discover a decision you have delayed because both choices carry consequences. You might discover a habit that continues because it gives you immediate comfort. Or you might discover that the obstacle is real, but that you have been using its existence to avoid deciding what you are willing to do about it. That is where the deeper work begins. An excuse is not always a lie, and confronting excuses does not require harshness toward yourself. It requires enough honesty to examine what happens between discomfort and action. Once you can see that moment clearly, you are no longer reacting automatically. You have identified the point where responsibility begins. But recognizing the pattern raises a harder question. If you already understand that avoidance is influencing your behavior, why do you continue choosing it when you know the long-term cost? The answer leads beyond excuses themselves into the decisions you make when discomfort is present, and that is where self-discipline becomes a matter of personal responsibility. Chapter 2. Accept personal responsibility to replace explanations with deliberate decisions. Personal responsibility begins when you stop asking only what happened and start asking what you will do next. This shift sounds simple, but it changes the quality of your decisions. When something goes wrong, the human mind naturally searches for causes. Someone disappointed you. Your manager changed the deadline. Your family needed your attention. You were exhausted. You did not have enough information. These details matter, and ignoring them would be dishonest. But responsibility does not require pretending circumstances are irrelevant. It requires separating what caused a situation from what remains within your control. Imagine that you arrive late to work because traffic was unusually heavy. The traffic is not your decision, but what happens afterward still contains choices. You can communicate honestly with your manager, adjust your departure time tomorrow, investigate another route, or simply decide that lateness is unavoidable and repeat the same pattern. The first response acknowledges the circumstance without surrendering control. The second response turns an event into information. Personal responsibility operates in that space between what you cannot control and what you can still choose. This distinction becomes more important when life becomes complicated. Adults rarely control every condition surrounding their decisions. A parent may have unpredictable responsibilities. An employee may have a demanding supervisor. A person may be dealing with financial pressure, changing schedules, or obligations they never expected. Responsibility does not mean blaming yourself for everything that happens. In fact, excessive self-blame can become another form of avoidance because it focuses attention on judging yourself rather than deciding what to do. Responsibility is more precise. It asks, given the situation I am in, what part of the outcome is mine to influence? That question changes how you interpret setbacks. Suppose you apply for a position and receive a rejection. The company may have selected someone with different experience. The hiring process may have favored an internal candidate. There may have been factors you could never know. Accepting responsibility does not mean assuming the rejection was entirely your fault. Instead, you might examine the quality of your application, the clarity of your interview answers, the number of positions you pursued, and the skills you could strengthen. You are not responsible for controlling the employer's decision. You are responsible for deciding whether the experience produces useful information or simply becomes another reason to stop trying. People often resist this form of responsibility because it removes the comfort of waiting for circumstances to improve. If your progress depends entirely on other people changing, you can postpone action without making an explicit decision. You can say that you will begin once your schedule becomes easier, once your partner becomes more supportive, once your workplace becomes less stressful, or once you feel more prepared. Sometimes those changes really are necessary. But if your plans always depend on conditions becoming ideal, your future remains controlled by conditions you do not manage. There is also a social dimension to responsibility. When something goes wrong, people frequently build explanations that make their behavior understandable to others. A person misses an important deadline and immediately explains everything that happened during the week. A friend forgets an agreement and focuses on how busy they have been. An employee makes a mistake and lists the confusing instructions they received. These explanations may be accurate. The problem begins when explanation replaces ownership. You can explain why something happened and still acknowledge that your decision contributed to the result. Those two statements are not contradictory. Consider a manager who receives incomplete work from an employee. The employee explains that another department delayed information, which is true. The manager could respond by assigning blame or could ask what communication should have happened earlier. The employee could defend themselves or could identify the point where they should have followed up sooner. Responsibility does not require accepting unfair criticism. It requires being willing to identify your actual contribution without exaggerating it and without minimizing it. That level of accuracy is difficult because it does not offer the emotional simplicity of having one person to blame. Your relationship with promises also reveals how responsibility works. Every time you tell yourself that you will complete something, you create an expectation about your future behavior. If you repeatedly make commitments without considering the demands they require, the problem is not simply poor scheduling. You are making decisions about your future self based on what feels manageable in the present moment. You might agree to help someone, accept another project, start an ambitious routine, and schedule several personal goals without considering whether they can coexist. Later, when the pressure becomes obvious, you may blame your lack of time. But the shortage of time was partly created by earlier decisions. This is why deliberate decision-making requires looking beyond the immediate moment. Before accepting another responsibility, ask what it will require from you next week, not just what it requires from you today. Before committing to a new habit, consider whether the schedule is realistic. Before saying yes to someone else's request, consider what you are saying no to by giving them your time. These questions are not signs of selfishness. They are ways of making your commitments more accurate. Responsibility becomes easier when your decisions reflect the actual limits of your life. The same principle applies to money. Someone may repeatedly feel financially trapped while continuing to make purchases that conflict with their stated priorities. Their income may genuinely be limited, and that limitation deserves recognition. But if every financial difficulty is explained only through income, spending decisions remain invisible. Looking honestly at both sides can be uncomfortable. You may discover that some expenses are necessary, some are meaningful, and some are simply habits you have never examined. Responsibility does not require eliminating every enjoyable purchase. It requires accepting that spending choices have consequences, and that those consequences belong to the person making the choices. There is an important difference between responsibility and control. Responsibility asks what you can influence. Control assumes you can determine the outcome. Confusing the two creates unnecessary frustration. You can prepare carefully for an interview, but you cannot force someone to hire you. You can communicate clearly with a partner, but you cannot control how they respond. You can create a healthy routine, but unexpected events may interrupt it. Mature responsibility allows uncertainty to remain present while still requiring a decision about your own behavior. This distinction becomes especially valuable during conflict. Imagine a disagreement with someone you care about. Your first instinct may be to explain why your behavior was justified. You may remember what they said first, what they did previously, or how their actions affected you. Those details may matter, but they can also distract you from examining your own response. Did you raise your voice? Did you avoid answering a direct question? Did you make an assumption instead of asking for clarification? Did you continue an argument after realizing neither person was listening? Taking responsibility for your contribution does not mean accepting responsibility for the entire conflict. There is strength in being able to say, internally and honestly, "This part belongs to me." That statement can apply to a missed opportunity, a broken commitment, an unhealthy routine, a poor financial decision, or an avoidable argument. It does not require self-punishment. It creates a boundary around your influence. Once you identify what belongs to you, you can decide what to change. Without that identification, you remain focused on everything outside your control. Another important issue is the difference between intention and decision. People often judge themselves by what they meant to do. They intended to call their parents. They intended to finish the report. They intended to save money. They intended to become more organized. Intentions matter because they reveal what you value, but intentions do not produce outcomes by themselves. A deliberate decision includes a behavior and a condition. Instead of saying, "I need to exercise more," you decide when, where, and under what circumstances you will exercise. Instead of saying, "I should spend less," you decide which category of spending will change and how you will monitor it. Responsibility becomes concrete when intentions become observable choices. This also explains why vague commitments can feel satisfying without producing much change. A person tells themselves they are going to take their career more seriously, become healthier, communicate better, or manage their time. The statement creates a temporary feeling of direction. But because nothing specific has been decided, there is little to evaluate later. A deliberate decision creates accountability because it can succeed or fail in observable terms. You either made the call, you either completed the application, you either protected the hour you had reserved for important work. The clarity can feel uncomfortable because it removes ambiguity, but that same clarity makes learning possible. Responsibility also requires accepting the consequences of decisions without immediately turning them into evidence about your identity. If you spend money you intended to save, that does not mean you are permanently irresponsible. If you break a commitment, that does not mean you are incapable of discipline. If you make a poor decision, you can evaluate the decision without condemning the person who made it. This separation matters because shame often produces defensiveness. When people feel that admitting a mistake threatens their entire self-image, they become more likely to justify the mistake, hide it, or blame someone else. Accurate responsibility requires enough emotional stability to examine behavior without treating every error as a verdict on your worth. Think about how differently you respond when you believe a problem belongs entirely to someone else. Your attention moves outward. You monitor their behavior, wait for their apology, or hope they change. But when you identify something that belongs to you, your attention becomes more practical. You can make a call, change a schedule, clarify a boundary, repair a mistake, or revise a decision. This does not guarantee the outcome you want. It simply places your effort where it can have some effect. That is the deeper function of personal responsibility. It is not a demand to carry every burden or accept every accusation. It is a refusal to surrender your decision-making simply because circumstances are imperfect. You become more deliberate when you stop asking whether the situation is fair enough for you to act, and start asking what action is appropriate given the situation that actually exists. There will still be days when you make poor choices. You will still underestimate how long something takes, misread another person's intentions, accept too much work, lose patience, or postpone something important. Responsibility does not eliminate these moments. It changes what happens after them. Instead of spending most of your energy constructing a defense, you can examine the decision, identify what information was missing, and determine what you will do differently next time. That process gradually changes the relationship you have with your own decisions. You become less dependent on circumstances, giving you permission to act. You begin evaluating choices before making commitments. You become more careful about what you promise, what you prioritize, and what you allow to consume your attention. Most importantly, you begin recognizing that responsibility is not something you claim when things go well and abandon when they do not. It is a way of approaching ordinary decisions with greater honesty. Yet there is one difficulty that remains. Even when you know what belongs to you, knowing is not the same as responding well. You can recognize your responsibility and still become overwhelmed by anger, anxiety, disappointment, or frustration. You can understand the right decision and still struggle to make it when emotions become intense. That raises a deeper question. What happens when the person making the decision is emotionally flooded, and how much of your behavior is actually being directed by feelings you have not learned to regulate? Chapter 3. Observe emotional triggers before they dictate your daily behavior. Emotional triggers often become powerful before you consciously recognize them. A message arrives with a tone you dislike. Someone questions your decision. A task becomes more difficult than expected, or a familiar problem appears at the wrong moment. Within seconds, your emotional state can change. You may become irritated, anxious, discouraged, defensive, or restless. The important issue is not that these emotions appear. Emotional reactions are part of ordinary human experience. The issue is what happens next. If you act immediately from the emotional state, the feeling can influence a decision that you might have made differently after a few minutes of reflection. A trigger is not necessarily a dramatic event. Sometimes it is something remarkably ordinary. You open your banking app and notice an unexpected expense. You see an email from your supervisor with the words, "Can we talk?" You sit down to study and realize the material is more difficult than you expected. Someone you care about takes longer than usual to respond to a message. None of these events automatically requires a particular reaction, yet each can activate a familiar emotional pattern. The first step in emotional control is learning to notice the pattern while it is happening, rather than only analyzing it afterward. This requires paying attention to the physical and mental changes that accompany emotion. Your breathing may become faster, your shoulders may tighten, your attention may narrow toward whatever seems threatening or frustrating. Your thoughts may become more absolute. Instead of considering several possibilities, you may begin thinking in terms of always, never, everyone, or nothing. These changes can happen quickly enough that the reaction feels like a direct response to reality. But there is a difference between an event and your interpretation of that event. Learning to notice that difference gives you a small but important space for choice. Consider a person receiving critical feedback at work. The feedback may be reasonable, but the person immediately feels embarrassed. Their mind begins producing explanations. The manager does not understand the situation. The project was rushed. Other employees made similar mistakes. The criticism was unfair. Some of these thoughts may contain valid information, but they are arriving while the person is emotionally activated. If they respond immediately, they may defend themselves instead of listening. Later, when the emotional intensity decreases, they may recognize that part of the feedback was useful. The difficulty was not the existence of criticism, it was the speed with which emotion shaped the response. That speed matters in everyday discipline. Many decisions that look like failures of willpower are actually responses to predictable emotional states. You plan to work on an important project after dinner, but you arrive home mentally drained. The thought of beginning feels unpleasant, so you sit down and watch something for a few minutes. You intend to stop after one episode, but the emotional need for relief remains stronger than the original plan. The next morning, you may describe yourself as undisciplined, A more useful question is what emotional state made avoidance attractive at that specific time. Were you exhausted, frustrated, lonely, overstimulated, or simply unwilling to experience another demanding task? This does not mean every behavior can be explained by emotion. Practical circumstances matter. Fatigue matters. Environment matters. But emotional states can influence how you evaluate those circumstances. When you are frustrated, a manageable task can feel unreasonable. When you are anxious, a normal uncertainty can feel dangerous. When you are disappointed, a temporary setback can feel more permanent than it actually is. When you are angry, another person's behavior can appear more intentional than the available evidence supports. The emotion changes the interpretation, and the interpretation influences the decision. One of the most useful forms of self-awareness is therefore identifying recurring emotional conditions. Notice when certain behaviors repeatedly appear together. Perhaps you procrastinate after receiving criticism. Perhaps you spend money after a stressful workday. Perhaps you become argumentative when you feel ignored. Perhaps you abandon routines after one disappointing result. Perhaps you check your phone whenever a task becomes mentally demanding. These patterns are valuable because they show you where emotion and behavior are connected. You do not need to judge the pattern immediately. First, you need to see it clearly. A simple internal question can help. What am I feeling right now, and what is this feeling asking me to do? Anger may push you toward confrontation. Anxiety may push you toward reassurance or avoidance. Disappointment may push you toward quitting. Boredom may push you toward stimulation. Shame may push you toward hiding. None of these impulses is automatically wrong. They are signals about your current state, not commands that must be followed. The ability to distinguish between an emotional impulse and a deliberate decision is central to emotional control. Imagine that you are working from home and receive a short message from a client saying they are unhappy with your work. You immediately feel defensive. Your first impulse is to write a long response explaining everything that went wrong. Before sending it, you notice your heart rate has increased and your attention is fixed on proving that you are not responsible. That observation changes the situation. You have not solved the disagreement, but you have recognized that you are currently in a state where defending yourself feels urgent. You can choose to review the client's specific concerns first and respond later. The emotional reaction still exists, but it no longer automatically determines the timing or content of your response. This is different from suppressing emotion. Suppression would mean pretending that you are not upset or forcing yourself to feel nothing. Emotional control does not require emotional absence. In fact, refusing to acknowledge an emotion can make it harder to understand what is influencing your behavior. If you are angry, recognize the anger. If you are disappointed, recognize the disappointment. The practical question is what the emotion is contributing to your interpretation, and whether acting from that state would produce the result you actually want. Another important distinction is between the trigger and the meaning you assign to it. A coworker interrupts you during a meeting. The observable event is the interruption. The meaning might be, "They do not respect me." That interpretation may be correct, but it may also be one of several possibilities. Perhaps they misunderstood when you were finished. Perhaps they were anxious about the topic. Perhaps they were simply impatient. The purpose of considering alternatives is not to excuse disrespect. It is to prevent your first interpretation from becoming an unquestioned fact. When emotions are strong, certainty can arrive before evidence. This becomes especially important in close relationships. A partner forgets to call when they said they would. You may immediately experience disappointment and then interpret the event as evidence that you are not important to them. That conclusion can influence the next conversation. Instead of asking what happened, you may communicate your hurt through sarcasm, withdrawal, or accusation. The other person reacts defensively, and now the original missed call has become a larger conflict. The emotional trigger was real. The meaning attached to it may have been incomplete. Observing that difference can prevent one moment from controlling the entire interaction. There are also internal triggers that do not require another person's behavior. A person may feel inadequate after comparing their career progress with someone else's. They see a former classmate announce a promotion online and suddenly question their own choices. Nothing has directly happened to them, yet the emotional reaction can alter the rest of their day. They may lose focus, criticize their accomplishments, or make an impulsive decision to change direction without thinking carefully. The trigger was comparison. The deeper issue was the meaning attached to another person's progress. Recognizing this pattern allows the person to examine what they actually want instead of reacting to someone else's timeline. Emotional triggers can also influence how you use time. When an important task produces anxiety, checking notifications may provide immediate relief. When a difficult conversation creates tension, you may suddenly find several unrelated tasks that seem urgent. When you feel mentally depleted, entertainment becomes more attractive. The behavior makes sense in the short term because it changes your emotional state, but the original responsibility remains. This is why emotional awareness matters for discipline. Many distractions are not primarily about the distraction. They are attempts to change how you feel. You can test this by observing your behavior when a task becomes uncomfortable. Do you immediately reach for your phone? Do you start organizing something unrelated? Do you check email repeatedly? Do you suddenly become concerned about minor household tasks? Ask yourself whether the behavior is actually necessary or whether it simply produces a more comfortable emotional state. This question can be revealing because the distraction often feels justified. You are not consciously saying, "I am avoiding discomfort." You are simply noticing something else that seems worth doing. The goal is not to eliminate every uncomfortable emotion before taking action. That would make disciplined behavior dependent on feeling good. A more stable approach is to recognize the emotion while allowing the decision to be based on something broader than the emotion itself. You can feel nervous and still have the conversation. You can feel bored and still complete the task. You can feel disappointed and still review what happened. You can feel frustrated and still wait before responding. The emotional state remains part of the experience without becoming the sole authority over behavior. This becomes easier when you notice the timing of your strongest reactions. Some people are more reactive when they are tired. Others become impatient when they have been working without breaks. Some become emotionally sensitive after prolonged social interaction. Others react more strongly when they feel rushed or uncertain. These patterns do not excuse behavior, but they can help you anticipate vulnerable moments. If you know that your judgment becomes less reliable when you are exhausted, you can be more cautious about making major decisions late at night. If you know criticism triggers defensiveness, you can give yourself time to process feedback before responding. There is also value in noticing the difference between an emotion and a lasting preference. You may feel like quitting your job after a humiliating meeting. You may feel like ending a relationship during a painful argument. You may feel like abandoning a goal after a disappointing result. The feeling can be intense enough to make the decision seem obvious, but intensity does not automatically mean clarity. Sometimes an emotion tells you that something important needs attention without telling you exactly what action should follow. Anger may indicate that a boundary was crossed. It does not necessarily tell you how to respond. Disappointment may reveal that a goal matters. It does not necessarily mean the goal should be abandoned. The ability to delay a reaction is therefore a form of psychological maturity. A delay does not mean avoiding the issue. It means allowing additional information to enter the decision. You can write the email without sending it. You can take notes about the disagreement before discussing it. You can wait until morning before making a major purchase. You can finish the workday before deciding that your career is going nowhere. These small delays can create enough distance to distinguish what you genuinely believe from what you feel at one particular moment. That distance becomes especially valuable when your emotional reaction is familiar. If the same situation repeatedly produces the same behavior, you can begin anticipating it. Maybe every time your supervisor gives you feedback, you immediately feel inadequate. Maybe every time your partner becomes quiet, you assume something is wrong. Maybe every time you make a mistake, you want to stop trying. Repetition creates an opportunity for observation. Before the familiar reaction fully develops, you can recognize the early signs and ask what is happening. The goal is not perfect control. The goal is earlier awareness. Earlier awareness changes what is possible. If you only recognize anger after sending the message, the opportunity for choice has already narrowed. If you notice irritation while drafting the message, you have more options. If you only notice financial anxiety after making an impulsive purchase, reflection comes late. If you recognize the urge to spend when stress begins, you can examine what you are trying to relieve. Awareness is most useful before behavior becomes automatic. This is why keeping a brief record of recurring reactions can be valuable. You do not need an elaborate system. After a difficult moment, note what happened, what you felt, what you immediately wanted to do, and what you actually did. Over time, patterns may become visible. You may discover that procrastination appears after uncertainty rather than laziness. You may discover that arguments begin when you feel dismissed. You may discover that impulsive decisions increase when you are tired. The purpose of observation is not to produce another reason to criticize yourself. It is to understand the conditions under which your behavior becomes less deliberate. There is a quiet difference between saying, "This is just how I am," and saying, "This is how I tend to react under these conditions." The first statement turns a pattern into an identity. The second turns it into information. If you believe you are simply an impatient person, you may stop looking for causes. If you recognize that impatience appears when you feel rushed, you can examine the situation more carefully. If you believe you are bad at difficult conversations, you may avoid them indefinitely. If you notice that anxiety rises when you cannot predict another person's response, you can begin working with uncertainty rather than defining yourself by avoidance. Emotional control becomes more practical when you stop demanding that emotions disappear and start becoming interested in what they influence. What does anger make you overlook? What does anxiety make you assume? What does disappointment make you conclude? What does boredom make you seek? What does shame make you hide? These questions do not require immediate answers. They require honest observation. And eventually, a more difficult question appears. If you can identify the emotional state that repeatedly pulls you away from your intentions, what will you do when that state returns tomorrow, when you are tired, distracted, frustrated, or discouraged? Awareness gives you information, but information alone does not create a different pattern. The next stage is learning how to build behavior that remains reliable even when motivation and emotion are changing. Chapter 4: Design habits that reduce reliance on motivation and willpower. Motivation is useful, but it is an unreliable foundation for consistent behavior. It changes with sleep, stress, mood, workload, environment, and recent experiences. You may feel highly motivated on Sunday evening while planning the week ahead. Then wake up Tuesday with very little interest in following the plan. If your behavior depends on feeling ready, the behavior will change whenever your internal state changes. This is why disciplined people do not necessarily possess more motivation than everyone else. They often rely less on motivation because their habits reduce the number of decisions required before action begins. A habit becomes useful when the behavior no longer requires a full internal debate each time. Think about ordinary actions you perform without much consideration. You brush your teeth, lock the door, check your calendar, or make coffee because those actions have become connected to familiar situations. You do not need to convince yourself that brushing your teeth is worthwhile every morning. The behavior has a place in your routine. Building productive habits follows the same basic principle. The objective is not to make every useful action exciting. It is to make the decision to begin increasingly simple. This distinction matters because many people design routines around their ideal emotional state. They imagine waking up early, feeling energetic, exercising, reading, working deeply, eating well, and ending the day with perfect consistency. The plan may look impressive, but it depends on several conditions remaining favorable. When one part fails, the entire routine can become difficult to maintain. A more practical approach begins with behavior that can survive ordinary life. Instead of asking, "What would I do on my most productive day?" ask, "What behavior can I reasonably repeat when the day is inconvenient?" Consider someone who wants to read more. They decide they will read for an hour every night, but their work schedule changes frequently. Some evenings they have family responsibilities, other nights they are mentally exhausted. After several missed sessions, they conclude that they lack discipline. The problem may be the design of the habit rather than the person's character. A habit requiring a fixed hour every evening may be poorly matched to their circumstances. A smaller rule, such as reading a defined number of pages after a regular evening activity, may be easier to repeat. The behavior becomes attached to an existing part of the day rather than depending entirely on motivation. This is one of the most important features of effective habit design. The behavior needs a clear starting condition. "I will exercise more" is an intention. "After I change clothes when I get home, I will complete my scheduled workout" gives the behavior a recognizable beginning. The more clearly you define when an action starts, the less mental negotiation is required. Ambiguity creates decisions. Decisions consume attention. A well-designed habit removes unnecessary uncertainty. The same principle applies to work. Someone who says, "I need to be more productive in the morning," has identified a desire but not created a behavior. A more useful structure might involve opening the day's most important document before checking optional messages. The value of this approach is not that checking email is always bad. It is that the first action has already been decided. The person does not need to determine their priority after opening the computer when dozens of incoming requests are competing for attention. Environment also influences habit reliability. If a behavior requires repeated resistance against an easily available alternative, willpower becomes more important. A person trying to reduce unnecessary phone use may keep the phone beside the computer while attempting to concentrate. Every notification, vibration, or visible icon creates another opportunity to make a decision. Moving the phone to another room changes the number of decisions required. The person is not becoming stronger through force alone. They are changing the conditions under which the desired behavior must occur. This is why habit design should include the removal of unnecessary choices. If you plan to exercise before work, deciding your clothing in the morning adds another small decision. Preparing it the night before does not guarantee that you will exercise, but it reduces one point of friction. If you want to cook more often, keeping basic ingredients available makes starting easier. If you want to work on a long project, keeping the necessary document organized and immediately accessible reduces the number of preliminary steps. Small environmental adjustments matter because repeated behaviors are affected by the effort required to begin them. There is another issue that often prevents habits from becoming stable. People make the behavior too large at the beginning. They become enthusiastic and create an ambitious routine that requires substantial time and effort. The first few days feel satisfying because novelty provides energy. Then normal life returns. Work becomes demanding. Sleep is interrupted. A social obligation appears. The routine becomes difficult, and missing it feels like failure. The person then abandons the system entirely. A smaller behavior can sometimes be more valuable because it establishes continuity before intensity becomes the expectation. Imagine someone who wants to strength train 3 times a week after years of inactivity. Starting with long workouts may be possible for a short period, but the physical and scheduling demands are significant. A more sustainable starting point might involve shorter sessions with a clearly defined schedule. The purpose is not to remain at the easiest level indefinitely. It is to establish a repeatable structure that can later expand. When the behavior becomes familiar, increasing the demand becomes a separate decision rather than a daily negotiation about whether to begin at all. This reveals an important distinction between building a habit and pursuing a result. Results can motivate you, but results are often delayed. A person may exercise for weeks before noticing meaningful changes. They may study for months before feeling highly competent. They may save money for a long time before reaching a significant financial goal. If the habit depends on immediate evidence that it is working, motivation will fluctuate. A behavior-based approach places attention on completing the action that is within your control today. Consistency also becomes easier when you decide in advance what counts as maintaining the habit. Without a clear standard, people often evaluate themselves emotionally. If they complete a full workout, they feel successful. If they only have 15 minutes, they may decide the session is not worth doing. This creates an unnecessary choice between perfection and nothing. A more flexible system can define a full version and a reduced version of the behavior. On a normal day, you follow the full routine. On a difficult day, you preserve the connection by completing a smaller version when appropriate. The exact structure depends on the habit, but the principle remains useful. Consistency does not require identical performance under every condition. However, flexibility should not become another excuse. If the reduced version becomes the default every time the behavior feels uncomfortable, the system has been redesigned to protect avoidance. The purpose of a smaller version is to accommodate genuine limitations, not to make effort unnecessary. This requires honest observation. Are you adapting because circumstances genuinely changed, or are you lowering the standard because you do not want to experience discomfort? The answer can change from one day to another. Habit design also benefits from immediate feedback. If a behavior has no visible indication of whether you completed it, it can be easy to lose awareness of your consistency. A simple calendar mark, checklist, or written record can provide information without turning the process into a complicated performance system. The point is not to create pressure, it is to make behavior visible. Memory is not always accurate, especially when days begin blending together. Recording what actually happened can reveal whether your routine is working as designed. Another useful principle is to separate starting from finishing. People often make a task feel difficult by mentally combining every step involved. I need to clean the entire apartment feels much larger than I will start with the kitchen counter. I need to complete this project feels overwhelming compared with "I will open the document and work on the first section." The beginning has its own psychological barrier. Designing a habit around a specific starting action can reduce that barrier without pretending that the entire task is easy. This becomes especially relevant for work that requires concentration. A person may sit down intending to write for 2 hours, but the large time commitment creates resistance before they begin. They check messages, adjust their workspace, search for information, and delay the actual work. If the initial commitment is instead to begin with a defined task for a short period, starting may feel less demanding. Once engaged, the person can continue if appropriate. The habit is attached to beginning the work rather than relying on enthusiasm about completing everything. There is also a social element to habit formation. People often design routines without considering the expectations of those around them. A parent may plan uninterrupted evening study while also managing a household. An employee may attempt a morning workout while regularly attending early meetings. Someone trying to improve sleep may continue accepting late-night social plans without adjusting expectations. A habit that consistently conflicts with important responsibilities will eventually require excessive effort to maintain. Good design considers the real structure of your life rather than assuming that your life will reorganize itself around the habit. The deeper purpose of habit design is to reduce the number of moments in which you must decide whether to do what you already decided matters. Every unnecessary debate creates another opportunity for temporary feelings to override longer-term priorities. If you have already decided that a certain behavior is important, repeatedly reopening the decision may not provide useful information. It may simply create another chance to postpone. A clear routine can preserve attention for decisions that actually require judgment. Still, habits are not automatic forever. Circumstances change. A new job changes your schedule. A child changes your responsibilities. Travel interrupts familiar routines. Illness, stress, or major life events can disrupt established behavior. When this happens, the answer is not necessarily to abandon the habit or demand that the old routine continue unchanged. You can redesign the behavior around the new conditions. The ability to adjust the structure without abandoning the underlying priority is an important part of long-term consistency. This also changes how you interpret a missed day. One interruption does not tell you whether the system is effective. What matters is whether you examine the reason for the interruption and decide what happens next. If your routine failed because the schedule was unrealistic, modify it. If it failed because the environment made distraction too easy, change the environment. If it failed because the task was too demanding, reconsider the starting point. The useful response is not emotional punishment, it is information about the design. Eventually, the most important question becomes less about how motivated you feel and more about how much of your behavior has been deliberately structured. When an important action has a clear time, place, starting condition, and reasonable level of effort, you no longer need to negotiate with yourself from the beginning every day. That does not eliminate resistance. It changes how often resistance gets to participate in the decision. And this raises a deeper issue. Even a well-designed habit can fail if your attention is constantly being pulled toward competing demands. You can create a routine, prepare your environment, and know exactly what you intend to do, yet still lose the day to interruptions that appear small individually but consume your attention collectively. The next challenge is not simply making action easier. It is deciding what deserves your attention before everything else begins asking for it. Chapter 5. Protect focused time by eliminating predictable distractions and interruptions. Focused time begins with a decision about what deserves your attention before the day starts making that decision for you. Most interruptions do not arrive announcing themselves as distractions. They often appear as reasonable requests, useful notifications, quick questions, or small tasks that seem too minor to postpone. A message arrives and you answer it. An email appears and you check it. Someone asks for a quick favor and you shift your attention. None of these actions seems serious by itself. The difficulty is cumulative. When your attention is repeatedly redirected, important work receives whatever mental energy remains after everything else has been handled. Attention is limited in a practical sense. At any given moment, you can consciously process only a certain amount of information, and shifting between unrelated tasks requires adjustment. If you move from writing a report to answering a text, then to checking an online account, then back to the report, the physical movement may take only seconds. The mental adjustment can take longer. You have to remember where you stopped, what you were thinking, and what you intended to do next. This is why an afternoon filled with small interruptions can feel exhausting, even when no individual interruption seemed demanding. The first step is to identify predictable distractions rather than treating every interruption as unexpected. Look at a normal workday and ask what repeatedly pulls you away from meaningful tasks. Is it email, group chats, news updates, co-workers stopping by, social media, household chores, repeatedly checking financial accounts? The answer will differ from person to person. What matters is that the distraction is predictable enough to be observed. If something happens regularly, it is no longer simply bad luck. It is part of the structure of your day. Consider an employee who begins working on an important presentation at 9 in the morning. They keep their email open because they want to remain responsive. Every few minutes, a new message appears. Most require no immediate action, but each one creates a decision. Should they answer now? Should they remember it for later? Is the message important? Could there be another message that needs attention? By 11, they have spent 2 hours around the presentation without giving it sustained attention. They may honestly feel that they worked all morning. The problem is not a lack of effort, it is that their attention was repeatedly divided. Responsiveness can also become psychologically rewarding. When you answer a message, complete a small request, or clear an easy task, you receive immediate evidence that something has been accomplished. Difficult work often provides no such quick confirmation. A complex report may require an hour before you can point to meaningful progress. A simple email may take 30 seconds and produce an immediate sense of completion. This creates a subtle preference for activities that offer quick closure. If you are not careful, your day can become organized around finishing whatever is easiest rather than advancing what matters most. This is one reason people can be busy without being productive. Activity creates visible evidence of effort, while focused progress can remain less visible. You can spend an entire morning responding to other people's needs and still feel that your own priorities were neglected. The distinction is important because productivity is not simply the amount of movement in a day. It is also whether your attention was directed toward the outcomes you consider important. A full schedule does not automatically represent a well-used schedule. Protecting focused time, therefore, requires more than telling yourself to concentrate. You need to make interruptions less available during periods when concentration matters. This might mean closing email, silencing non-essential notifications, placing your phone outside immediate reach, or telling coworkers when you will be available again. The specific method depends on your environment. The underlying principle is simple. If an interruption is easy to access, you will repeatedly have to decide whether to resist it. If access is reduced, fewer decisions are required. Some people resist this because they believe constant availability demonstrates professionalism. In certain jobs, Immediate responsiveness genuinely matters. Emergency services, customer support, management roles, and caregiving responsibilities can require rapid attention. But even in demanding environments, not every communication has equal urgency. The practical question is not whether you should ever be interrupted. It is whether every interruption deserves immediate access to your attention. If everything receives the same priority, the most important work can become impossible to protect. The same issue appears outside work. Imagine someone who wants to spend an evening studying for a professional certification. They sit at the kitchen table with their materials open, but their phone remains beside them. A friend sends a message. They answer. A news notification appears. They check it. They remember an online purchase they need to make. They open another app. Soon they have spent an hour near their study materials without engaging deeply with them. Later, they may say they simply could not focus, but concentration was being repeatedly interrupted by a system they had left completely accessible. This is where environmental design becomes more important than personal criticism. If you already know that a certain notification repeatedly captures your attention, leaving it enabled is not neutral. You are creating a condition that requires repeated restraint. The same is true when entertainment websites remain open during demanding work, or when personal messages appear on a device used for concentration. You do not need to believe that you are incapable of self-control. You simply need to recognize that reducing unnecessary exposure can make focused behavior easier to sustain. There is also a difference between planned interruption and reactive interruption. Planned interruption occurs when you decide when you will check messages, review email, or handle routine administrative work. Reactive interruption occurs when the arrival of a message determines when you switch tasks. The content may be identical, but the psychological position is different. In the first case, you control when attention shifts. In the second, another event controls the timing. This distinction can significantly change how much uninterrupted attention remains available for meaningful work. For example, an employee might decide to review email at 10:30, 1:30, and 4:30 while keeping notifications off during concentrated work. That does not mean email is being ignored. It means email has been assigned a place. The person can still respond to important issues, but they are not allowing every incoming message to determine the structure of the day. This kind of scheduling works because it turns an open-ended demand into a defined activity with boundaries. Boundaries can feel uncomfortable because other people may initially react to them. A coworker may ask why you did not respond immediately. A family member may expect quick replies. A friend may interpret delayed responses personally. This does not mean boundaries are always appropriate or that other people's needs should be dismissed. It means attention has social consequences. Protecting focus sometimes requires communicating clearly about when you are available and when you are not. The absence of explanation can create confusion, while a simple expectation can reduce unnecessary interruptions. There is another source of distraction that is easier to overlook: self-generated interruption. You can be interrupted without anyone contacting you. While working on a document, you remember an unrelated task. You suddenly want to research something. You wonder whether you received a response from someone. You think about an unresolved personal problem. You decide to reorganize your files. These thoughts are normal. The challenge is deciding whether every thought deserves immediate action. If every new thought becomes a task, your attention will continually leave the activity in front of you. A simple practice can help with this. When an unrelated thought appears during focused work, write it down rather than acting on it immediately. If you suddenly remember that you need to schedule an appointment, record it. If you think of a question you want to research, record it. If you remember a household task, record it. This creates a temporary place for the thought without allowing it to determine your next action. Later, during an appropriate planning period, you can decide what deserves attention. The important distinction is between noticing a thought and obeying it. This becomes especially valuable for people who confuse urgency with importance. An urgent task demands attention because something is waiting now. An important task contributes to a meaningful outcome, but may not create immediate pressure. Email can be urgent. A notification can feel urgent. A deadline can become urgent. Exercise, learning, planning, relationship maintenance, and long-term projects may be important without producing immediate demands. If your schedule is controlled entirely by urgency, important activities can remain postponed until they become emergencies. You can see this clearly in financial planning. Paying a bill that is due tomorrow may be urgent. Reviewing your long-term spending may be important. The first task creates immediate pressure, while the second may not. If you only respond to what demands attention today, you may repeatedly postpone the work that would reduce future problems. The same pattern appears in health, career development, relationships, and personal projects. Protecting focused time means deliberately reserving attention for important work before urgency consumes the available space. There is also a psychological reason people allow interruptions to continue. Constant activity can protect them from difficult concentration. Focused work often requires staying with uncertainty. You may not know how to solve the problem. You may have to revise your first attempt. You may discover that your understanding is incomplete. Interruptions provide an easy escape from that uncertainty. Checking a message is clear. Completing a small administrative task is clear. Returning to a complicated problem requires more tolerance. Sometimes the distraction is attractive not because it is interesting, but because the primary task is mentally uncomfortable. That is why improving focus is partly an exercise in recognizing the difference between legitimate interruption and emotional avoidance. If you repeatedly become restless at the exact moment a task becomes difficult, the issue may not be your environment alone. You may have created a distraction-friendly environment because some part of you prefers quick relief to sustained uncertainty. The solution then requires both environmental changes and greater honesty about what you are trying to escape. Another important factor is transition time. After an interruption, people often expect themselves to return immediately to full concentration. Realistically, the mind may need a moment to reconstruct the task. If interruptions happen constantly, these small recovery periods accumulate. A person may spend much of the day repeatedly restarting. This is particularly costly for writing, analysis, studying, planning, programming, design, and other activities that require holding several pieces of information in mind at once. The more complex the task, the more valuable uninterrupted periods become. This suggests that focused time should be treated as a scheduled activity rather than an empty space that other tasks can automatically occupy. If you leave an hour completely unprotected, someone or something will eventually use it. If that hour is assigned to a specific priority, you have a clearer reason to defend it. The schedule does not need to be rigid. It needs to make important attention visible. A calendar entry can communicate to you, and sometimes to others, that the period has a purpose. At the same time, protecting focus does not mean eliminating every spontaneous experience from your life. Some interruptions are valuable. A colleague may have an important question. A child may need immediate attention. A friend may need support. An unexpected opportunity may appear. The goal is not to create a life where nothing can interrupt you. It is to distinguish between interruptions that genuinely matter and those that have simply become habitual. Flexibility is easier when you are not already spending your entire day responding to low-value demands. You may also discover that your attention is being divided by unfinished decisions. You are trying to work while mentally tracking an appointment, a household problem, an unanswered message, or an upcoming conversation. Even when your phone is silent, the unresolved issue remains active in your attention. This is one reason planning can support focus. Writing down what needs to be handled, deciding when you will handle it, and identifying what information you still need can reduce the need to repeatedly remind yourself. The mind does not have to keep reopening the question simply to avoid forgetting it. Focused time also becomes easier when you know what you are trying to accomplish during that period. Work on the project is less specific than draft the introduction and review the first 3 sections. A defined outcome reduces the temptation to drift because you can tell whether your attention is still connected to the intended task. This does not mean every work session needs a rigid target. It means clarity makes distraction easier to recognize. Without a clear objective, almost any activity can appear relevant. There is a quieter form of distraction that comes from constantly evaluating your own performance. While studying, you wonder whether you are learning fast enough. While writing, you question whether the work is good enough. While exercising, you compare your progress with someone else's. Instead of staying with the activity, part of your attention monitors whether you are succeeding. This self-monitoring can consume concentration. Sometimes the most useful approach is to define the task clearly and postpone evaluation until the scheduled review period. You do not need to judge every minute while performing it. The same principle applies to creative work. If you judge every sentence while writing it, you may interrupt the process repeatedly to correct minor issues. If you are researching a topic, you may continue searching for better information long after you have enough to proceed. Focus requires knowing when to collect information and when to use it. Otherwise, preparation itself becomes an endless source of interruption. The ability to protect attention includes knowing when a task has enough information to move forward. Over time, your relationship with distraction can become more deliberate. You begin noticing which notifications deserve to remain active, which conversations need immediate access, which tasks should be grouped together, and which activities require uninterrupted time. You may discover that some distractions are environmental, some social, some emotional, and some self-generated. Each requires a different response. Turning off a notification will not solve anxiety about an unfinished decision. Scheduling email will not solve the habit of checking it every 5 minutes. Moving your phone will not solve a lack of clarity about what you are supposed to accomplish. The deeper lesson is that attention is not protected simply by wanting to concentrate. It is protected by making deliberate decisions about access, timing, environment, and priority. Every time you allow a predictable interruption to determine your next action, you give that interruption a place in your decision-making process. Every time you establish a boundary around important work, you make your priorities more visible through behavior rather than intention. Eventually, this changes how you experience a day. You may still receive messages, encounter problems, and handle unexpected responsibilities, but not every event has to become an immediate command. Some things can wait, some thoughts can be recorded, some requests can be scheduled, some notifications can remain unopened, some tasks can be grouped together rather than scattered across the entire day. The difference is not that life becomes quiet. The difference is that you become more deliberate about what receives your attention. And that creates another question that is harder to avoid. Once you have protected your time from predictable distractions, what happens when the distraction is no longer external at all? What happens when the phone is silent, the schedule is clear, and no one is interrupting you, yet you still find yourself avoiding the work that matters? At that point, the issue is no longer simply where your attention goes. It is whether you are willing to remain consistent when there is nothing external left to blame. Chapter 6. Practice consistent follow-through to strengthen self-respect and confidence. Self-respect is influenced by how you experience your own behavior over time. It is not created only by achievements, compliments, appearance, or the approval of other people. There is another quieter source of self-respect, knowing that when you make a reasonable commitment to yourself, you usually follow through. That experience changes how seriously you take your own decisions. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you will do something and then abandon the commitment, the immediate consequence may seem small. But repeated inconsistencies can gradually affect the way you evaluate your own reliability. You begin to recognize a gap between what you say matters and what you actually do. This does not mean every unfinished task damages your self-respect. Life changes, priorities shift, and some commitments should be reconsidered. A promise made under circumstances that no longer exist may need to be changed. The important issue is whether you make that change deliberately or simply stop following through because the original commitment became inconvenient. There is a meaningful difference between revising a decision and quietly abandoning it. One requires judgment. The other can become a pattern of avoidance. Consistent follow-through begins with understanding which commitments deserve completion and which genuinely need to be renegotiated. Think about something as ordinary as agreeing to call a family member. You intend to do it, but the day becomes busy. You remember in the evening, feel tired, and tell yourself you will call tomorrow. The next day, the same thing happens. No dramatic consequence occurs. But internally, you have now accumulated another example of making a commitment without completing it. If this happens repeatedly, the issue is larger than one missed phone call. Your mind is receiving information about how dependable your own intentions are. What happens to your confidence when you repeatedly hear yourself make promises that your behavior does not support? Confidence is often discussed as a feeling of certainty or belief in your abilities, but confidence can also be grounded in evidence. If you have repeatedly completed difficult tasks, handled uncomfortable conversations, learned unfamiliar skills, or honored important commitments, you possess experiences that support a more stable assessment of yourself. You do not need to convince yourself that you are capable through positive statements alone. Your behavior has already provided evidence. Follow-through matters because it creates that evidence gradually through ordinary actions that may seem insignificant while they are happening. Consider someone who decides to complete a professional certification while working full-time. They do not know whether they will pass. They may doubt their ability. They may have days when studying feels difficult. But each week that they complete the study sessions they committed to, they gather information about their ability to stay engaged with a demanding goal. Their confidence does not need to depend entirely on the eventual exam result. It can also develop from seeing themselves continue through uncertainty. This is a different kind of confidence because it is based less on predicting success and more on knowing how they tend to behave when success is not guaranteed. There is an important distinction between confidence in an outcome and confidence in your response. You cannot always know whether a business proposal will be accepted, whether an interview will lead to a job, or whether another person will respond positively to an honest conversation. But you can become more confident that you will prepare carefully, communicate clearly, learn from the result, and make another decision afterward. That form of confidence is connected to follow through because it comes from repeated experience with your own behavior. You begin trusting yourself not because everything works out, but because you have evidence that you will participate seriously in what happens next. Follow-through also affects the way you set commitments. People sometimes make promises based on what they feel capable of doing at the moment, rather than what their actual schedule allows. They agree to finish a project by Friday because Friday feels comfortably distant. They promise themselves they will exercise every morning because the idea sounds manageable when they are planning it. They tell a friend they can help with a move without checking the rest of their schedule. When the deadline arrives, the commitment becomes difficult. The person may then think they have a follow-through problem when the deeper issue was careless commitment making. Reliable follow-through therefore begins before the commitment is made. Ask yourself whether you actually have the time, energy, resources, and willingness required. If you do not, saying no can protect your self-respect more effectively than saying yes and failing later. This can be uncomfortable because declining a request may create temporary disappointment. But making promises you do not intend or realistically expect to keep creates a different cost. You teach yourself that your own commitments can be made casually. Over time, that can weaken the seriousness with which you approach your decisions. The same principle applies to personal goals. Suppose you decide to write for an hour every evening. After a few days, you realize that your evenings are consistently unpredictable. Instead of quietly abandoning the goal, you can make a deliberate adjustment. Perhaps the commitment becomes 30 minutes on specific days, or a different time becomes more realistic. The change does not represent failure. In fact, it can represent stronger follow-through because you are taking responsibility for designing a commitment you can actually honor. Reliability does not require stubbornly maintaining an unrealistic plan. It requires staying engaged with the decision rather than disappearing from it. There is also a difference between completing a task and completing the task well enough. Some people struggle with follow-through because they unconsciously define completion as perfection. If a report cannot be excellent, they delay submitting it. If a workout cannot be long, they skip it. If a conversation cannot be perfectly worded, they avoid having it. The standard becomes so demanding that ordinary completion feels inadequate. This can create an unusual cycle. The person appears highly ambitious, but their behavior becomes inconsistent because every commitment carries an excessive performance requirement. Follow-through becomes more stable when the definition of success is realistic enough to allow completion. This does not mean lowering standards whenever something becomes difficult. It means separating quality from perfection. A professional can revise a report carefully while still recognizing when it is ready to submit. A student can study seriously without requiring complete mastery before taking an exam. A person can apologize sincerely without finding a flawless explanation for their behavior. In each case, follow-through requires recognizing when additional effort meaningfully improves the result, and when additional effort simply postpones completion. Your relationship with unfinished tasks can reveal a great deal about this distinction. Look at the things you repeatedly start but rarely complete. Are they projects that lose their appeal after the initial excitement? Are they commitments that require sustained effort without immediate reward? Are they tasks where you fear evaluation? Are they goals you chose because they sounded impressive rather than because they genuinely mattered? The answer can reveal why follow-through breaks down. Not every unfinished project needs more discipline. Some need a clearer reason for continuing. This is where self-respect becomes connected to honesty. If you no longer care about a goal, admitting that may be more respectful than continuing it simply because you once announced it. If a commitment has become unreasonable, renegotiating it may be more responsible than pretending you can still meet it. But if you still consider the commitment important, and repeatedly abandon it whenever the initial enthusiasm disappears, the pattern deserves a different response. Follow through is not about completing everything. It is about becoming more deliberate about what you choose to complete and more reliable about honoring those choices. Confidence can also be weakened by constantly seeking external confirmation before acting. Someone may need another person to approve every decision because they do not trust their own judgment. They ask several friends whether they should apply for a position, change a routine, start a project, or have a difficult conversation. Advice can be valuable, especially when decisions are complex. But if you repeatedly transfer responsibility for ordinary choices to other people, you lose opportunities to build evidence that you can make reasonable decisions yourself. Following through on your own considered choices allows confidence to become more internally supported. Imagine deciding to take a course that could improve your career. You research it, consider the cost, evaluate the schedule, and determine that it is a reasonable choice. After enrolling, you begin wondering whether someone else would have chosen differently. You ask several people for reassurance. Their opinions conflict. Your uncertainty increases. At some point, you have to decide whether to trust the evaluation you already made or continue looking for certainty. Follow through sometimes means allowing a decision to become real enough to be tested. You learn from the result afterward. There is another way consistent follow-through strengthens self-respect. It reduces the need to constantly negotiate with yourself. When you have repeatedly demonstrated that important commitments will be honored, the internal conversation becomes simpler. You do not need to ask every morning whether the decision still feels appealing. You already know that your behavior has a history of supporting your stated priorities. This does not eliminate resistance. It changes the credibility of the resistance. A temporary desire to avoid something does not carry the same weight when you have established a pattern of completing what you deliberately chose. The reverse is also true. If you repeatedly abandon commitments, your future intentions may become less convincing to you. You tell yourself that this time will be different, but another part of your mind remembers what happened before. You create a new plan, feel hopeful for a few days, and then lose confidence when the familiar difficulty returns. The problem is not necessarily a lack of ambition. You may simply have accumulated too much evidence that your intentions are not consistently translated into behavior. Rebuilding trust with yourself requires behavior, not another promise. That rebuilding process should be measured realistically. If you have developed a long pattern of inconsistent follow-through, do not expect one successful week to completely change how you perceive yourself. Self-trust develops through repeated experiences. Completing a reasonable commitment today gives you one piece of evidence. Completing another tomorrow gives you another. Over time, the pattern becomes more informative than any single success or failure. This is why ordinary consistency can have psychological importance even when no one else notices it. Small commitments can be especially useful because they create opportunities for accurate evidence. Suppose you decide to spend 15 minutes organizing your finances every Sunday. The task is not dramatic. It will not transform your financial life in one session. But if you repeatedly make the appointment with yourself and keep it, you begin demonstrating that your decisions can have continuity. The psychological value is not in the size of the task, it is in the relationship between intention and action. You decided, and then you followed through. Still, there is a danger in becoming obsessed with keeping every commitment, regardless of circumstances. A person can become so focused on proving reliability that they refuse to adapt when adaptation is clearly necessary. They may continue an ineffective project because quitting feels like weakness. They may maintain an unrealistic schedule because changing it feels like failure. They may stay committed to a goal that no longer reflects their values Mature follow-through includes evaluation. You need to know not only how to continue, but also when a decision deserves reconsideration. One useful question is, am I changing this commitment because reality changed or because discomfort increased? The distinction can be subtle. Reality may have changed because your job responsibilities increased, your financial situation shifted, or an important family obligation emerged. Discomfort may have increased because the task became boring, difficult, uncertain, or emotionally demanding. Both situations feel unpleasant, but they call for different responses. One may require redesigning the commitment, the other may require continuing it despite reduced enthusiasm. This distinction becomes important in long-term relationships as well. A healthy relationship requires follow-through on ordinary responsibilities, not just strong feelings. If you repeatedly say you will handle a household task and fail to do it, the issue can become larger than the task itself. Your partner may begin adjusting their expectations around your promises. They may stop asking because they assume they will eventually need to handle it themselves. The loss is not simply practical, it concerns trust. Reliable behavior communicates something that words cannot fully communicate, that another person can reasonably plan around what you say you will do. The same principle applies to professional reputation. Co-workers remember who consistently completes assignments, who communicates when deadlines change, and who can be trusted with responsibilities without repeated reminders. No single missed deadline defines a career, but repeated patterns influence how others allocate responsibility. Follow-through, therefore, affects opportunities indirectly. When your behavior becomes predictable in a positive sense, people can coordinate with you more easily. Reliability becomes part of how others understand your professional judgment. Yet, the most significant relationship affected by follow-through may be the one you have with yourself. Other people can praise you or criticize you, but they do not experience every private decision you make. You know whether you completed the task you said you would complete. You know whether you practiced the skill when nobody was watching. You know whether you kept the appointment with yourself or quietly moved it again. These moments may seem invisible, but they contribute to your internal assessment of who you are. This is why self-respect should not be confused with self-esteem. Self-esteem can rise and fall with comparison, achievement, appearance, recognition, or social feedback. Self-respect can be strengthened by behaving in ways that you personally consider responsible and honest. You may not feel confident every day. You may still question your abilities, but if your behavior repeatedly reflects your considered commitments, you have a stronger basis for respecting your own decisions. The process also changes how you respond to failure. If your identity depends on always succeeding, a setback threatens your confidence. If your confidence is partly based on follow-through, a setback can become information without completely destroying your self-assessment. You can say, in effect, "This did not work, but I participated fully in the process." That distinction matters. You can lose an opportunity while still maintaining respect for how you handled it. You can fail an exam after studying seriously. You can make a sincere proposal that is rejected. You can train consistently without reaching the result you expected. The outcome matters, but your response also provides evidence about your reliability. There is quiet strength in becoming someone whose actions are understandable even to themselves. You know why you made the commitment. You know what standard you agreed to. You know when you completed it and when you did not. You know when circumstances justified a change and when discomfort simply made continuation unpleasant. This clarity reduces the need for dramatic self-judgment. You can evaluate your behavior with greater precision because you have established standards that are based on decisions rather than moods. Eventually, consistent follow-through begins to affect the way you approach new challenges. You may still experience uncertainty, but you have more evidence about your ability to remain engaged. You may still feel nervous, but you have seen yourself act while nervous. You may still experience disappointment, but you know that disappointment does not automatically end your effort. Confidence becomes less dependent on predicting what will happen and more connected to knowing that you will take your commitments seriously. There is still a limit to what follow-through can accomplish by itself. A person can work consistently on the wrong priority. They can complete every task on their schedule while allowing less important demands to consume their life. They can become highly reliable at responding to everything except the work that matters most. Consistency without direction can produce a disciplined routine that leads nowhere meaningful. That leaves a deeper question. Once you have learned to trust yourself to complete what you deliberately choose, how do you decide what deserves that level of commitment in the first place? The answer requires examining how you choose between competing demands, what you allow to consume your time, and whether your daily decisions reflect the priorities you claim to have. Chapter 7. Regulate setbacks through reflection, adjustment, and deliberate emotional control. Setbacks become most useful when you stop treating them as final judgments and start examining what they can teach you about your decisions. A disappointing result can create an immediate emotional reaction: frustration, embarrassment, anger, sadness, or self-doubt. That reaction is understandable, but it can also distort the way you evaluate what happened. You may decide that the entire effort was pointless, that you are incapable, or that circumstances will never improve. The emotional response arrives before the analysis. Learning to regulate setbacks means creating enough space between the event and your conclusion that you can examine what actually happened. Imagine preparing carefully for a job interview and receiving a rejection. The first response may be disappointment. You may replay the interview and focus on every moment that felt awkward. Perhaps you remember one answer you wish you had phrased differently. If you immediately conclude that you are not qualified, the rejection becomes an identity judgment. If you immediately blame the company, you lose an opportunity to learn anything from the experience. A more useful response separates the result from the information. You were not selected. That is the result. What caused it may be partly knowable and partly uncertain. Your task is to examine what evidence exists before deciding what the event means. Reflection requires more precision than simply asking whether something went well or badly. Those categories are too broad to produce much learning. Instead, examine the sequence of decisions that led to the outcome. What did you expect? What actually happened? Which factors were within your influence? Which factors were outside it? What information did you have at the time? What information became available afterward? These questions turn a setback into something that can be studied. They also reduce the tendency to judge yourself based only on the final result. This distinction matters because outcomes are not always accurate measures of decision quality. A careful decision can produce a disappointing result, while a careless decision can occasionally produce a favorable one. Someone may invest time in a well-researched opportunity that does not work out. Another person may make an impulsive choice that happens to succeed. If you evaluate decisions only by their outcomes, you may learn the wrong lesson. You might become afraid of reasonable risks because one thoughtful attempt failed, or become overconfident because one careless choice happened to work. The emotional response to a setback can also influence the quality of your reflection. When you are highly upset, your attention often narrows toward the most painful part of the experience. You may remember the rejection, but forget the useful feedback. You may focus on the mistake, but ignore the parts of the process that went well. This is why immediate reflection does not always need to mean immediate analysis. Sometimes the first useful action is simply allowing the emotional intensity to decrease enough that you can think more accurately. A delayed evaluation can be more honest than a rushed one. Consider someone who makes an embarrassing mistake during a presentation. Immediately afterward, they may feel exposed and mentally replay the moment. If they start redesigning their entire career that night, their judgment may be heavily influenced by embarrassment. Waiting until the next day can change what they notice. They may realize that the presentation was mostly effective, but one section needed better preparation. The emotional experience was real, but it was not a complete description of the performance. Emotional regulation allows the event to become specific instead of global. There is a useful difference between feeling bad about an outcome and deciding what the outcome requires. You may feel disappointed because you missed a goal. That feeling deserves acknowledgement. But disappointment does not automatically tell you whether to continue, change the strategy, reduce the goal, or stop entirely. Those are separate decisions. When people allow the emotion to make the decision, they may quit something they still value simply because continuing temporarily feels painful. Reflection creates a second stage in which the situation can be evaluated independently of the first emotional response. Adjustment then becomes possible. An adjustment is not the same as abandoning the goal. It means changing part of the approach because the available evidence suggests the current approach is not producing the desired result. A person trying to improve their health may discover that their planned workout schedule repeatedly conflicts with work obligations. Instead of concluding that they cannot maintain exercise, they can examine the schedule and choose a different time. The goal remains while the method changes. This distinction prevents a failed strategy from being mistaken for a failed person. Sometimes, however, adjustment requires changing the goal itself. A person may discover that a career path they pursued for years no longer fits their interests, responsibilities, or values. Continuing simply because they have already invested time can create additional costs. Reflection allows them to distinguish persistence from attachment. Persistence means continuing because the objective remains meaningful and the evidence supports further effort. Attachment can mean continuing because changing direction feels like admitting that earlier decisions were wrong. Those are psychologically different reasons. The fear of admitting a mistake can interfere with adjustment. People often protect previous decisions because changing them can feel like criticizing themselves. If you spent years pursuing a certain plan, changing direction may create thoughts about wasted time. Yet, refusing to adjust does not recover that time. It only determines what you do with the time that remains. Reflection becomes more useful when the question changes from, "Was I wrong to choose this?" to, "Given what I know now, what decision makes the most sense?" Emotional control is particularly important when setbacks involve other people. A disagreement at work, a breakup, a conflict with a friend, or a disappointing interaction can produce strong urges to assign blame. Sometimes another person genuinely behaved poorly. The goal is not to excuse harmful behavior. The goal is to prevent anger from eliminating your ability to think clearly about what response serves your interests. You can decide that a boundary is necessary without sending an impulsive message. You can be disappointed without making a permanent decision during a temporary emotional peak. There is also a difference between reflection and rumination. Reflection examines an event with the intention of understanding it and deciding what to do next. Rumination repeatedly revisits the same event without producing new information or a decision. You replay the conversation. You imagine what you should have said. You criticize yourself. You consider alternative outcomes. Then you repeat the process later. The mind feels active, but little changes. Reflection asks questions that lead somewhere. Rumination often asks the same question repeatedly, without accepting that the event cannot be changed. You can recognize the difference by examining whether your thinking produces a specific adjustment. After reviewing a failed project, perhaps you decide to clarify expectations earlier next time. After a financial mistake, perhaps you change how you monitor discretionary spending. After an argument, perhaps you recognize that difficult conversations become less productive when they happen late at night. These are concrete conclusions. If your thinking produces only more criticism, more imagined alternatives, and more emotional distress, you may be analyzing without learning. Setbacks can also reveal weaknesses in systems that success had previously hidden. A routine may work when your schedule is calm, but collapse during a busy period. A communication strategy may work with one coworker, but fail with another. A financial plan may look reasonable until an unexpected expense appears. Success under ideal conditions does not always demonstrate that a system is robust. A setback can expose where the system needs greater flexibility. This information is valuable because it allows you to prepare for real conditions rather than designing your life around unusually favorable ones. Think about someone who has maintained a careful budget for several months. Then their car requires an expensive repair. They may feel that the entire financial plan has failed, but the event can reveal something more specific. The plan may have lacked a sufficient emergency reserve. That does not make the earlier budgeting useless. It shows what the next version needs. The setback becomes a source of information about the difference between a plan that works under normal conditions and one that can tolerate unexpected expenses. The same principle applies to personal growth. You may believe you have become more patient until a particular situation produces an unexpectedly strong reaction. That does not necessarily mean all progress was imaginary. It may show that your ability to remain calm depends on certain conditions. Perhaps you handle ordinary disagreement well, but become defensive when criticism comes from someone whose approval matters deeply to you. That discovery can be uncomfortable, but it gives you a more accurate understanding of yourself. Growth becomes more specific when you learn where your current abilities stop working reliably. There is value in reviewing setbacks before making the next major commitment. If a previous attempt failed because you underestimated the time required, do not simply promise to work harder next time. Examine the original estimate. If a project failed because responsibilities were unclear, clarify roles before beginning again. If a routine failed because it depended on too much free time, redesign the schedule. A useful adjustment changes the conditions that contributed to the problem. Simply increasing determination without changing the relevant conditions may produce the same result. This is also where emotional control protects against overcorrection. After a setback, people sometimes respond by making an extreme new plan. They missed several workouts, so they decide to exercise every day. They overspent, so they impose unrealistic restrictions. They procrastinated, so they create an excessively rigid schedule. The emotional discomfort of failure can create a desire to prove that the problem will never happen again. But extreme corrections often ignore the original reasons the behavior failed. A calmer response asks what adjustment is necessary, not what punishment would feel satisfying. You may notice that thoughtful adjustment often feels less dramatic than emotional reaction. There is no immediate sense of redemption. You simply examine the situation, identify a specific problem, and change one part of the process. This can feel almost too ordinary. But ordinary adjustments are often more sustainable because they are connected to evidence rather than emotional intensity. The goal is not to create a powerful response to every setback. It is to create an accurate one. Another important part of recovery is deciding what does not need to change. When something goes wrong, people often assume the entire approach needs to be rebuilt. That can create unnecessary instability. Suppose a presentation failed because the speaker rushed through the final section. That does not mean their research method, topic selection, and preparation process were all ineffective. Perhaps only the rehearsal structure needs adjustment. Good reflection identifies the smallest meaningful change rather than destroying everything that was working. This principle can prevent discouragement. If every setback becomes evidence that your entire approach is defective, each mistake carries too much psychological weight. But if you can isolate the specific part that needs improvement, the event becomes manageable. You are not rebuilding your entire life because one decision produced an undesirable outcome. You are correcting a particular process. This level of precision makes it easier to continue without pretending that the setback did not matter. There are also setbacks that cannot be fixed. Some opportunities disappear. Some relationships end. Some decisions cannot be reversed. Some consequences remain even after you understand exactly what happened. In these situations, adjustment may involve accepting a permanent change rather than trying to recreate the original outcome. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means recognizing that continued resistance to an unchangeable fact will not restore what has already been lost. Reflection can then move toward a different question. What does this new reality require from me now? That question can be difficult because the mind often wants closure before it is willing to move forward. You may want to know exactly why someone rejected you. You may want to understand every reason a project failed. You may want another person to acknowledge their role in a conflict. Sometimes that information will never become available. Emotional maturity includes knowing when further analysis is unlikely to produce useful information. At some point, the absence of certainty becomes part of the situation you must make decisions within. A setback can also reveal how dependent your emotional state is on external results. If you feel confident only when you are succeeding, failure can produce a sudden collapse in self-evaluation. You may go from feeling capable to feeling worthless after one disappointing outcome. That shift suggests that confidence was tied too closely to performance. A more stable internal standard allows you to evaluate the result without allowing it to define your entire sense of capability. You can acknowledge poor performance while maintaining a realistic belief that improvement remains possible. This does not require positive thinking. It requires accurate thinking. If you performed poorly, say so. If you made a bad decision, identify it. If you neglected an important responsibility, acknowledge it, but then ask what the evidence actually supports. Does one poor performance prove you will always perform poorly? Does one rejection prove you are not qualified? Does one failed routine prove you cannot change? Usually, the available evidence is narrower than the conclusion produced by the emotional reaction. Accuracy gives you room to make a better decision. The process of reflection, adjustment, and emotional control therefore creates a different relationship with setbacks. You do not need to welcome disappointment. You do not need to pretend failure feels good. You simply stop requiring the emotional experience to determine the meaning of the event. You allow the feeling to exist, examine the facts, identify what can be learned, and decide what should change. Sometimes the adjustment will be behavioral, sometimes it will be structural, sometimes it will involve changing a goal, sometimes it will involve accepting something that cannot be changed. Over time, this process develops a quieter form of resilience. Resilience is not the absence of disappointment. It is the ability to remain capable of thoughtful action after disappointment occurs. You can experience frustration without becoming reckless. You can experience embarrassment without withdrawing completely. You can experience failure without turning it into an identity. You can experience uncertainty without demanding an immediate answer. The emotional experience remains real, but your capacity to make decisions remains available. And there is a deeper challenge hidden inside that capacity. It is possible to become very good at recovering from mistakes while still repeating the same type of mistake, because your reflection never changes the structure of your decisions. You may understand why something went wrong and still recreate the conditions that produced it. At that point, resilience alone is not enough. You need to examine how you choose what deserves your effort, what you are willing to prioritize, and whether your decisions are based on what matters most rather than what demands attention first.